Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It was Philip Hammond's first autumn statement as Chancellor and the government's first major assessment of the economy after Britain voted to leave the EU in June. He got to his feet against the latest independent review from the Office for Budget Responsibility. It said the economy would see slower growth for 2 years. It also pointed to a massive increase in government borrowing in the same period. Mr. Hammond accepted that we're going through a period of uncertainty, but he said the government will confront the challenge head-on, investing in infrastructure projects such as housing and the digital industries. Labour said the government was unprepared and ill-equipped for Brexit and had no vision. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, has the first of tonight's reports.
Preparing for the worst, Chancellor!
Preparing for the worst is what this Chancellor does. Tucked under his arm, detailed plans, economic guesswork...
Are you feeling gloomy?
...and precious little to cheer about. Phil Hammond didn't want to talk down Britain's prospects after Brexit, but they call him Spreadsheet Phil for a reason. His day's work at Westminster meant showing in hard, cold numbers a dark side to the vote to leave the EU. The time for his first big statement as Britain's Brexit Chancellor arrived.
Chancellor Philip Hammond.
And MPs were handed his verdicts on what that vote meant for us all.
That decision will change the course of Britain's history.
The Chancellor's message, the road to Brexit could be bumpy, money would be tight, and the economy had to up its game.
Our task now is to prepare our economy to be resilient as we exit the EU and match fit for the transition that will follow.
The transition, on his figures, would hold back the economy.
While the OBR is clear that it cannot predict the deal the UK will strike with the EU, its current view is that the referendum decision means that potential growth over the forecast period is likely to be 2.4 percentage points lower than would otherwise have been the case.
The predicted cost was high. The public purse would be £122 billion worse off, deeper in debt over 5 years. Of that, £58.7 billion was marked as a direct consequence of Brexit, which, if borne out, meant public debt equivalent to over 90% of national earnings next year. The stats came up too fast for MPs to keep up or even understand, though the Chancellor did his best.
That's complicated, but it's good news.
But there'd be yet more borrowing. He claimed there was no alternative.
Raising productivity, Mr. Speaker, is essential for the high-wage, high-skill economy that will deliver higher living standards for working people across this country. I can announce that we are forming a new National Productivity Investment Fund of £23 billion to be spent on innovation and infrastructure over the next 5 years, investing today for the economy of the future.
The Chancellor promised money for housing, a £2.3 billion fund for 100,000 homes, and more for cheaper housing. For roads and road improvements, another billion, and another for Britain's digital network. But what about those millions struggling to get by, people at the sharp end, sharper when wages fall behind inflation? There'd be limited easing of the benefits squeeze, and past promises on tax would be kept.
I said that the tax system must be fair, and that means rewarding those who work hard by helping them to keep more of what they earn.
So the pledge to raise personal tax allowances would be honoured. The national living wage would go up, £7.20 an hour to £7.50. And under the new universal credit, people could earn a little more and keep more benefits.
This is effectively a targeted tax cut worth £700 million a year by 21-22 for those in work on low incomes. It will increase the incentive to work and encourage progression in work, and it will help 3 million households across our country.
With money tight, so was the extra spending. But in the end, the Chancellor's tone was upbeat.
We have made our choices. We have set our course. We are a great nation, bold in our vision, confident in our strengths, and determined in our ambition to build a country that works for everyone. I commend this statement today.
Praise from the PM.
John McDonnell.
Not that political opponents were impressed, of course, not for a second.
After all the sacrifices people have made over the last 6 years, I fear today's statement has laid the foundations for more wasted years. Only a Labour government will deliver on the ambition and vision to rebuild and transform our economy so that no one and no community is left behind.
He's clearly admitted the previous 6-7 years of austerity had failed, and the numbers confirm that. You know, the debt figure, which we were promised in 2010 for 2015, will not now be reached in this Parliament at all.
It's the day that the long-term mythical Tory economic plan was replaced by a short-term economic scramble with worsening forecasts for the public finances and economic growth, which are going to impact on people's jobs and financial well-being.
Then, outside Parliament as well as in, there were those impatient to leave the EU.
Brexit now!
And losing patience with all the gloomy predictions.
The OBR are probably still quite wrong about 2017. Their forecast is too low, their borrowing forecast far too high, and we will get good access to the single market once we're out of the EU.
The Chancellor painted a grim picture, but it might easily have been worse. At one point, he seemed to hint that the guarantee on the value of pensions could be up for grabs after another election. That really would be a political gamble. Many months, more autumns and winters will come and go before we see the real cost and benefit of Brexit. The risks and the rows here and in the country won't wait to find out. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
So it seems that the first casualty of what Philip Hammond calls a period of uncertainty is the budget surplus that the former Chancellor George Osborne had planned by 2020. Instead, Britain will be in the red for longer. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity has been looking at the numbers.
What's Brexit got to do with austerity? If the country votes for one, it gets less of the other. Deep spending cuts are still going ahead, but the Chancellor's big move in today's autumn statement was to relax the official targets for cutting the deficit and the debt. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Here is the fundamental reason why. The official forecast is for a big knock to economic growth. In March, the economy was supposed to grow like this, but now the forecast is for growth to slow down sharply, especially next year, as we all struggle with higher prices caused by the weak pound. And if the economy grows more slowly, that means fewer jobs created, fewer goods and services bought and sold, so less income tax, less VAT and other taxes rolling in. To keep up his spending, the Chancellor will have to borrow more. In March, the amounts he'd have to borrow looked like this over the next few years. He gets into surplus in 5 years' time. But now it looks like this. Those red bits are the extra amount he'll have to borrow because the economy is growing more slowly. Add them up, and over 5 years, he'll have to borrow £122 billion more.
The main drivers are weaker income tax receipts, plus upward revisions to our forecasts for local authority spending and the cost of incapacity and disability benefits. This more than offsets lower debt interest costs and the strength of some other tax receipts.
Now, because the Chancellor's borrowing more each year, that adds to the accumulated borrowing built up over the years, the debt. Right now, it's £1.61 trillion. That's about 84% of the value of everything we produce in a year. Every car, every bus ride, every haircut. It's higher than Germany, but lower than France. But now it's expected to get up to £1.95 trillion 5 years from now, much closer to French or US borrowing levels. To try and boost growth, a new £23 billion fund has been set up to invest in infrastructure and innovation.
In the current challenging environment, and I think we saw that confirmed today in the OBR forecasts, this is a good down payment on that. And I think if it is used well and crucially invested rapidly, could make a good difference to the economy.
Low-paid working families across the country will still get much less of an income top-up when the new universal credit comes in. But overall, the policies announced today add £8 billion more to spending by the end of this Parliament. Less austerity for many, but not all. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Well, let's talk to our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, who's at Westminster for us. Laura, it's a very bleak economic picture. How much of that is really down to Brexit?
Well, officially, George, nearly £60 billion of the extra borrowing is down to Brexit. That's the numbers that have been put forward. But there's no question that the uncertainties of our vote to leave the EU are what hung over the backdrop of all of this statement today. Borrowing is back in a way that we just had not expected it to be. We're going to be borrowing billions more for longer. The cuts are going to continue. And millions of consumers will feel the pinch too as wages are sluggish and inflation starts to bubble up. For the government, this is a really, really difficult set of circumstances. Of course, important to say, these forecasts could turn out to be wrong. For many people, the view of what lies ahead is just too grim. And the forecasts are not for some kind of short, sharp, dramatic recession. It's more a prediction of years of drudge to come. But perhaps that's why Philip Hammond rather tantalisingly raised these questions about what the country could really afford in the longer term, just hinting, that the Tories might be willing to look again at their promises to protect pensioners' payments and also that vow they've made for years now to protect the NHS. There was a suggestion in the statement they might reopen those whole ideas. Philip Hammond is a very low-key politician. He didn't want to make a big fuss today or to have a big show. But in terms of what he set out, there are plenty of dramas ahead.
Laura, thank you. Now, let's have a look at some of the other measures announced by the Chancellor today. There was extra money for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. There was help for people renting homes in England. Will no longer have to pay fees to letting agents. Savers will be able to put money in a new bond with what Mr Hammond called a market-leading interest rate. The fuel duty rise has been cancelled for the 7th year in a row, and the tax paid on everyone's insurance for their cars, homes and possessions will rise. Now, the Chancellor highlighted the cost of Brexit as one of the factors influencing his decisions today. Rita Chakrabarti has been gauging the mood in Whitby, North Yorkshire, where people voted overwhelmingly in favour of leaving the EU. Rita.
George, I'm here at the Magpie Cafe, which is one of many fish restaurants here in Whitby. Fish and chips, of course, was the national dish that an Italian minister recently said we might export less of because of Brexit. Frivolous, perhaps, but it did speak to fears about our economic future. I've been speaking to people here about the Chancellor's statement and also about the prospects ahead. As the Chancellor was preparing the country to seize future economic opportunities, the Magpie Kitchen was preparing lunch. It may be out of season, but this popular cafe had no shortage of customers.
Chancellor Philip Hammond.
Dining and the deficit is a lot to digest, especially with added slower economic growth. But this construction manager, who voted to remain, trusts this government.
Everyone can be assured in that case that we've got the right government for the job. I think the government generally, if you're a hard-working person and you go to work, you'll be rewarded for what you do.
Behind the comfort of the cafe lie hard financial times for some. Philip Hammond acknowledged the jams, or those just about managing, by increasing the national living wage for over 25s and a gentler tapering off of in-work benefits. Deborah Loseley says people she knows need help.
Well, I've lived on the estate where I lived 20 years and I've seen a big difference. People used to be able to, like Christmas presents, buy it. Now everybody's struggling and families are struggling quite bad. And it's frightening to watch them because, like, you see the kids, like you see them in nice clothes, things like that. Now they're not, they're struggling.
Whitby voted decisively for Brexit, so the present economic uncertainty will have been down in part to voters here. But it's hard to find many who will confess to worry.
I think it would have probably happened anyway. So. But personally, it doesn't worry me. I think, you know.
Why not?
Why not? Because I'm retired, basically.
Pensioners like Mike have done well in recent years, but he and wife Jackie have 2 adult children who can't afford to move out. The government's promise to build more homes, will that help?
I think on their wages it would still be difficult for them to have their own individual home, personally. You know, with bills, living costs, travelling to work.
Budgets are always a balancing act, and the Chancellor didn't have much room for excitement.
Voters here can accept the present choppiness if they think there might be calm waters ahead. Rita Chakrabarti, BBC News, Whitby.
I've been getting